What if a handful of incidents between 1931 and 1934 did more than fill headlines? What if they quietly rearranged the international chessboard so that the next major war became not a single inevitable event, but a far more likely outcome of a system under strain? In the span of just a few years, economic collapse, unilateral military action, and the breakdown of old diplomatic habits produced new incentives for confrontation and far fewer effective tools for restraint. The story of 1931-1934 is not a tale of destiny. It is a study in opened opportunities and closed exits. It asks how a world already wounded by the Great Depression, by ideological polarization, and by institutional fatigue ended up with governments that could see conquest as policy rather than catastrophe. In late 1931, the Great Depression was no longer a ripple in a single economy. It had become a global convulsion. Factories closed, trade collapsed. Unemployment rates that seemed unimaginable a decade earlier hardened into political reality. Governments cut budgets, and voters rewarded promises of security and strength over timid maintenance of the status quo. At the same moment, a small explosion on a railway in northeastern China, the event now remembered as the Mukden incident of September 18, 1931, became a test case for a new kind of international politics. One where military officers could manufacture a crisis, seize territory, and expect only a muted response from the system of collective security that had been built after the First World War. The Mukden incident was followed almost at once by an occupation. The Kwantung Army moved to control Manchuria and, within months, oversaw the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo. For many in Tokyo, the operation looked less like reckless adventurism and more like a practical solution to resource and population pressures, and to the humiliation Japan felt after its limited gains in the post-war order. The League of Nations dispatched an investigation, the Lytton Commission, which took months to report. When the League did pronounce that Japan had acted unlawfully, Japan answered not with reparations, but with withdrawal. In March 1933, Tokyo left the League, clear evidence that the actors most prepared to use force no longer cared to remain bound by the organization's authority. A brief vignette. The sailor on the Dalian docks watched the lamps of the city tilt in the harbor light as troop transports came in. He had been paid in grain ration cards and cigarettes. The idea of national pride, not wages, had become his bargaining chip. What this sequence did was more structural than moral. The League had been designed to make aggression costly in reputation and isolation. It required time and unanimity to act. But when a major offended nation could simply exit, the collective mechanism lost both teeth and rhetorical power. The Mukden operation taught militaries elsewhere a simple lesson. If you can secure objectives before other states can mobilize common resistance, resistance may never materialize in a meaningful way. By the time the League's condemnations circulated through Europe, other pressures had already been warping politics at home. The Great Depression amplified political polarization. In Germany, where the economy had never fully recovered from the burdens of reparations and hyperinflation of the 1920s, unemployment and a seeming national humiliation provided fertile ground for radical movements. In the elections of 1932, the National Socialists became the largest party in the Reichstag. Their success was not merely the result of propaganda. It was a political response to real suffering and institutional paralysis. Then came a string of decisive legal and extra-legal steps in 1933 and 1934 that converted electoral strength into consolidated authoritarian rule. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag burned in an event that remains deeply contested in interpretation. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, granting Hitler's cabinet the power to legislate without parliamentary consent. And in late June of 1934, the Night of the Long Knives removed key internal rivals and signaled both the regime's ruthlessness and its ability to act swiftly. When President Paul von Hindenburg died on August 2, 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, culminating a rapid institutional transformation from Weimar democracy to one-man rule. A short vignette. A clerk in a Berlin municipal office kept his desk lamp burning late into those months, watching laws that changed the routines of his work arrive in the post. The sense of normality thinned, then slipped. How did these domestic changes contribute to the broader international picture? First, they rewired the decision-making center. When foreign policy becomes concentrated in an executive whose survival depends on demonstrations of strength and national prestige, risk-taking tends to increase. Second, legal measures that dismantled political pluralism removed internal checks on military adventurism. Third, steps toward rearmament and withdrawal from international disarmament talks. Germany left the World Disarmament Conference and stopped complying with the Versailles military limits in 1933, signaled to neighbors that the post-war norms could be reversed by force or by simple noncompliance. Each of those steps made diplomacy more dangerous. Fewer voices could restrain escalation, and fewer fora remained where grievances could be negotiated under common rules. Across Europe, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was undergoing a different kind of transformation with similar systemic consequences. The first five-year plan, 1928 to 1932, prioritized rapid industrialization and state control over the countryside. The drive to build heavy industry and modernize defense production created a state more capable of sustaining a prolonged military effort. At the same time, forced collectivization produced catastrophic human consequences, particularly in grain-producing regions. The famine of 1932–33 in parts of Ukraine, the wider Soviet grain regions, and the North Caucasus caused millions of deaths by some estimates. Historians continue to debate the numbers and intent, with estimates for Ukrainian deaths often cited between roughly 3 million and 7 million. Whatever the precise figures, the policy consolidated a model of state power that showed how a government could use massive coercion to achieve rapid societal change. A state that could undertake such social engineering posed a different kind of challenge to the established order. Less open to bargaining, more capable of mobilizing resources on a national scale. A villager in eastern Ukraine remembered the carts of grain leaving and the months when the fields were left to fallow. Hunger, he said, made politics fragment into survival. Stalin's Soviet Union also fostered deep suspicion among its neighbors. Even as the USSR industrialized, it remained diplomatically isolated. It did not participate in the League, and its ideological export of revolution made many Western and Eastern European elites wary. That mutual distrust hardened the strategic environment. On one scale, Moscow was growing stronger. On another, it became ever more likely to be seen as either a threat or an unpredictable actor, which in turn influenced the calculations of Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had long sought to restore a sense of national grandeur through colonial conquest. The Italian campaign in Libya, a consolidation that stretched from late 1920s into the 1930s, was marked by brutal methods, including the use of chemical weapons and mass deportations against indigenous resistance. These practices normalized the use of extreme measures in pursuit of imperial gains and signaled that liberal international opinion could be navigated rather than crushed. Italy's approach was partly prestige-seeking. Mussolini needed overseas victories to shore up domestic legitimacy. That form of domestic political calculus, where external adventurism buys internal stability, is a recurrent theme of the early 1930s. Across southwestern Europe, Spain and Portugal were shifting toward authoritarian solutions as well. Political violence, coup attempts, and polarized politics in Madrid and Lisbon reflected the broader European trend toward leaders who promised order in exchange for liberty. These developments made the Mediterranean a more volatile theater, one where colonial rivalry and ideological conflict overlapped. A brief vignette. An Italian settler in a Libyan outpost wrote home with the kind of pride the newspapers asked him to feel. At night, he heard the distant boom of field guns, and he wondered how the men called rebels could be so persistent. Western democracies, meanwhile, faced their own limits. Britain and France had their own economic traumas and deeply rooted pacifist currents. Both countries were constrained by budgetary retrenchment, public reluctance to engage in foreign wars, and political calculation that favored avoidance. The United States, stunned by the Depression, turned inward. Even as Franklin D. Roosevelt began the New Deal in 1933 to stabilize the American economy, Congress and the electorate kept a wary distance from European entanglements. U.S. isolationism remained a powerful political force. The Senate had refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles less than a decade earlier, and by the early 1930s, American policymakers were focused on recovery rather than collective security. The international architecture designed in 1919–1920, the League of Nations, a patchwork of treaties, and a set of informal understandings, assumed that a set of like-minded powers would act to enforce norms. But two structural weaknesses emerged between 1931 and 1934. First, institutions that relied on moral suasion and economic or diplomatic penalties proved slow and dependent on unanimity. Second, the major powers most likely to pay the price for enforcement were themselves weakened domestically or unwilling to act decisively. When Japan ignored the Lytton Commission's findings, when Germany withdrew from disarmament talks, when Italy pursued colonial policy with impunity, the message was clear. The costs of aggression could be managed or borne by the victims, and the institutional price of stepping beyond those costs was lower than planners had assumed. A moment of synthesis. The pattern across these cases, Manchuria, Germany, the Soviet Union, Italy, and Western democracies, is the same structural logic repeated in different languages. Economic shock made political extremes more attractive. Political consolidation concentrated authority in hands willing to use force. Militaries and modernized states expanded capacities to project power. And the instruments meant to keep a lid on interstate violence, diplomatic consensus, economic sanctions, international courts, looked slow and fragile relative to the speed and decisiveness of modern militaries. Together, these shifts did not cause war by themselves, but they narrowed the options for peaceful restraint and widened the incentives for revisionist action. If you want the full multi-part timeline exploring 1931 to 1939 in more detail, subscribe and follow the series. This episode is the first step in that journey. This episode is brought to you in part by Hearts of Iron 4. If you're interested in exploring historical alternatives and testing how different political choices change strategic outcomes, their free weekend lets you try a grand strategy simulation. It's an optional way to engage with the history. The real world remained far less forgiving. Returning to the narrative, Germany's path to a revisionist foreign policy was accelerated by domestic consolidation. Rearmament began cautiously at first, often under civilian cover. Hiring programs, official claims of defensive needs, and reorganization of military industries. Once political obstacles were removed, however, rearmament gathered pace. Germany's withdrawal from the Geneva disarmament discussions in October 1933 was a diplomatic declaration that the Versailles framework was no longer binding. For neighbors, the message was not simply legalistic, it was about capacity and intent. When a major continental power begins to rebuild its military openly, neighbors must factor that into their security calculus, often by hedging, seeking alliances, or preempting changes in military balance. In the summer of 1934, the Night of the Long Knives did something else. It removed the possibility that a rival faction within Germany could slow Hitler's external ambitions. Eliminating internal competition made policy more coherent and more capable of sustained implementation. The consolidation also reduced the likelihood that Germany would return to negotiated revision of post-war borders. Unilateral action became more plausible because fewer internal actors could veto it. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, diplomatic ruptures and episodic violence punctured the web of alliances and understandings that had existed since 1919. The assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia on October 9, 1934, in Marseille, and the death of the French Foreign Minister Louis Barthou during the same attack exposed how fragile regional diplomacy could be. These events made neighboring states more nervous and highlighted the limited capacity of European powers to manage crises without escalating them. Compounding the problem, the World Disarmament Conference in Geneva, 1932 to 1934, failed to achieve meaningful limitations on arms. The conference's slow pace, combined with Germany's withdrawal and the reluctance of other states to bind themselves in a way that might leave them vulnerable, produced a sense that multilateral arms control was not a reliable policy instrument in times of intense insecurity. In Asia, the consequences of 1931 to 1934 extended beyond Manchuria. The assassination of Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi in May 1932 in Tokyo marked a turning point in political culture. Silence, intimidation, and assassination began to shape Japanese politics as much as electoral ballots or cabinet votes. The growing influence of the army was matched by an emergent doctrine that Japan had the right or the necessity to secure resources by force in East Asia. Japan's moves in China would not, in this period, reach full-scale total war. Instead, the pattern of using military agents to achieve rapid territorial gains without credible international punishment normalized a mode of behavior that could be escalated later. Across the Mediterranean, Mussolini watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and caution. He had already demonstrated in Libya and during interventions in other theaters that modern European imperialism still had room for forceful extension. Mussolini's interventions contributed to a continental conversation about prestige and status. If national greatness required empire, and empire could be taken with limited penalty, then conquest became a policy lever for domestic politics. The Soviet Union's growing industrial base introduced another strategic variable. A rapidly industrializing Soviet state could, in principle, sustain large military expenditures and projects. The 5-year plans emphasized heavy industry, steel, coal, armaments production, and though Soviet planners were often inefficient and brutal in pursuit of targets, the net effect by the mid-1930s was a country capable of mass mobilization. For Western planners, the Soviet capacity was a reminder that the balance of power in Europe was fluid. The possibility of encirclement was a constant fear in Berlin and elsewhere, and it colored decisions about alliances and military posture. A short vignette. A factory foreman in a Soviet foundry counted the hours over bright hot metal as new blast furnaces roared to life. He believed in the promise of steel, though many of his neighbors had vanished from the countryside. Why bid the democratic powers not act more decisively to prevent these destabilizing trends? For Britain and France, the calculus combined domestic politics, fiscal constraints, and a genuine war weariness that made the electorate reluctant to bear the cost of enforcement. Pacifist organizations had traction. The cost of mobilizing for distant conflicts or of risking renewed mass casualties seemed incomprehensible to many voters. Politicians read those signals and prioritized stabilization at home over distant moral enforcement. Economic retrenchment reinforced this tendency. With shrinking budgets, the scope for expeditionary operations narrowed. American isolationism further reduced the room for robust international action. The United States had not joined the League and remained focused on domestic recovery under Roosevelt's New Deal. While the U.S. government occasionally used economic leverage and diplomacy, it was not prepared to lead a sustained international enforcement regime in the early 1930s. That absence mattered. The global order that had relied on American economic and moral weight lacked one of its chief pillars at precisely the moment others were testing it. Taken together, these elements, militarized states willing to act, weakened democracies unwilling or unable to respond, and institutions that were slow and dependent on consensus, created a dangerous conjuncture. The structural implications were clear. When grievances could be pursued militarily without decisive outside intervention, and when domestic politics rewarded bold displays of national strength, the threshold for resorting to force dropped. Yet, it is crucial to emphasize contingency. None of these developments ensured world war on their own. A different set of domestic politicians, a timely and decisive response by major powers, or successful diplomatic innovations could have altered the trajectory. The value of focusing on 1931 to 1934 is that across these years, the frequency and variety of risky behaviors rose, while the tools for coping with them atrophied. The international system acquired more failure modes and fewer remedies. By the end of 1934, the map of incentives had shifted. Germany had centralized authority and begun rearming. Japan had signaled its willingness to seize territories and to leave international bodies that opposed it. Italy's colonial aggression normalized brutal imperial methods. The Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing and restructuring society through coercive means. And Britain, France, and the United States faced political economies that made expensive, distant interventions politically costly. Assassinations and political violence punctuated diplomacy, complicating alliance structures. The League of Nations, already hampered by structural weaknesses, had demonstrated an inability to deter determined aggressors. A final vignette. A British MP in Parliament, weary from economic debates, read dispatches about Manchuria and Berlin and wondered whether the century had merely looped back to a pattern of state competition that Britain could no longer master. Where did this leave Europe and Asia strategically? The new balance suggested that limited actions could have outsized consequences. If an ambitious state with a capable military and consolidated decision-making apparatus perceived an opportunity, a neighbor distracted by internal problems, an international body paralyzed by unanimity rules, or key guarantors preferring inaction, then taking that opportunity could alter regional balances rapidly. Small wars could produce large strategic shifts. That recognition is a central reason historians point to the early 1930s as formative. They created a permissive environment for revisionist strategies that required only a willingness to risk international disapproval. As the narrative moves beyond 1934, the conditions set in those years help explain why later events, remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the Spanish Civil War beginning in 1936, and the escalation in China after 1937 were possible and had the effects they did. The chain is not deterministic, but it is directional. Weakened enforcement, rising militarism, and economic desperation combined to make escalation more plausible and peaceful adjustment harder. In closing, the period from 1931 to 1934 should be read as a set of structural reconfigurations rather than a script of inevitability. It was a time when the levers of power were recast. Militaries learned that rapid action could succeed. Political leaders discovered domestic gains from foreign adventurism. International institutions showed they lacked rapid, credible enforcement tools. And the great democracies proved unable or unwilling to pay the price of sustained intervention. Recognizing that does more than explain the past. It clarifies a lesson about international politics more generally. When domestic distress converges with institutional frailty and military capability, the temptation to revise borders by force becomes a more attractive option to rulers facing domestic threats. If this account has sparked questions about specific events, the precise sequence in Manchuria, the legal mechanisms of the Enabling Act, the variety of estimates around Soviet famines, or the detailed timelines of rearmament, the rest of this series will dive into each thread with sources and maps. If you'd like access to bonus materials, maps, and primary source transcripts, consider supporting this channel through membership or Patreon. There you'll find suggested readings and a bibliography. Finally, as a practical way to engage with the strategic puzzles of the era, Hearts of Iron 4 is offering a free weekend which lets you experiment with alternative policies and timelines. It's an interactive, optional tool to test what-if scenarios, not a substitute for the complexities of real history, but a space to think through choices and consequences. The years between 1931 and 1934 did not write a single unalterable ending. They opened pathways. Some doors closed, others swung wide. The international system was not yet at war, but it had been remade in ways that made large-scale conflict considerably more likely. Understanding those years helps us see how fragile peace can become when economic collapse, concentrated power, and failing institutions intersect, and why recognizing those intersections matters for any effort to prevent future catastrophes.